Shoot.
I just gotta make sure you're framed correctly. Perfect. Okay. Here's my questions.
Why don't you shut the door?
Oh, sure.
Good.
Okay. So should I just jump right in, or?
Jump.
Okay. In your professional opinion, do you believe that raising the minimum wage to $9 this year raise the unemployment rate?
Yes, I believe that raising the minimum wage law from $7.50 to $9 will increase the unemployment rate compared to what it would have been otherwise had this raise not gone in. And I also take the view that having the minimum wage at $7.50 an hour also creates unemployment. And therefore what they should do is not only not raise it, not only not keep it level, not only not reduce it, but get rid of it. And not only that, but I think they ought to put in jail, and I say this advisedly, people responsible for the minimum wage in the first place. I do believe in ex post facto law. We established this at the Nuremberg trial, that just because something is legal doesn't make it just. The Nazis were saying, well, you know, to kill Jews and gays and blacks and Romani, it was the law, the German law. And who are you to tell us that, you know, we were just obeying orders? Well, I think what we ought to do is apply the Nuremberg trial to people responsible for the minimum wage law and put them in jail. Because what they've done is created havoc. They've created unemployment, especially for unskilled young black workers, whose unemployment rate is a multiple of the so-called unemployment rate of about 8 or 9%. Their unemployment rate is more like 40 or 50%, maybe 60%. If you count the discouraged worker effect, namely they don't count as unemployed people who have stopped looking for a job. But if you counted them, it's just devastating. And it's the same thing in France and in all these other countries where you got these young men that create riots because they're bored stiff. They can't get a job. Why? Because of the minimum wage law. So people responsible for this devastation should not be let lightly off the hook.
Okay. So you believe the market should decide what the wage is?
Without the minimum wage law, the market would decide what wages are, yes.
And do you believe that there would be a living wage?
A living wage, well, it depends on what you mean by living wage, but it would be higher than zero. And zero is what they get now. You see, don't think that the minimum wage law is like a floor under wages, and as you raise the floor, you raise people's wages. That's wrong. Rather think of it as a high jump bar. In order to get a job, you have to have a higher productivity than the level, and the higher the bar is, the harder it is to jump over it. So the minimum wage law doesn't raise anyone's wage. Rather, what it does is it says you can't get a job at all. See, the minimum wage law doesn't say, thou shalt go and employ people. Rather, it says, thou shalt, to put it in biblical terms, thou shalt not employ people unless you pay them $7.50. Well, suppose your productivity, you're a young guy, is only $5 an hour. And I am the employer, potential employer, and I'm thinking, you know, maybe I should give you a job, and I think you're worth $5 an hour, but I have to pay you $7.50? I'm going to lose $2.50 on you. And if I do it, it'll be out of generosity, goodness in my heart, and if I do it too much, I'll go broke. So I'm not going to last too long. So you're not getting any job. So which is more of a living wage? Let's say your productivity is $5 an hour. And we have a theory in economics that wages tend to equal productivity. So in the ordinary course of business, you'd be making $5 an hour. Now with the minimum wage of $7.50, you make zip. So which is higher, 5 or nothing? Well, obviously 5. Now is 5 living? I don't know. You can't really have a lot of fun on $5 an hour in today's prices, which is the fault of the Fed, but that's a whole other problem. But the point is that 5 is infinitely more than 0. And it's $5 more than 0, so you're better off at 5 than 0, ceteris paribus, other things equal. But the mistake is to think that the minimum wage law somehow raises productivity. It doesn't. Your productivity of $5 an hour means that if I have you on my shop floor, my receipts for the hour are $5 higher per hour than if you weren't there. And how a law is going to change that is beyond me. It's silly. It doesn't change that because your productivity depends upon you know, how many widgets you can put together or how much smiling you can do when you ask people if they want fries with that or whatever it is you're doing for $5 an hour. And the law can't change it. Look, if the law could change it, why are they being so niggardly and making it only $7.50 or $9 an hour? Why not make it $9,000 an hour? Now, wouldn't that be great? $9,000 an hour, we'd all have a living wage. We'd be very rich. I don't know if Bill Gates makes $9,000 an hour. Probably he does, but we'd be fantastically rich, according to the theory that the minimum wage law raises wages. But according to the theory that you have to jump over to get a job, well, $9,000 an hour, not too many people make $9,000 an hour. Maybe LeBron James does, and maybe, I don't know, Bill Gates does, and everyone else would be unemployed. So minimum wage is just a despicable, evil thing. And what really ticks me off as an economist is so many people are fooled into thinking that minimum wage law is a good thing. That's because they're economically illiterate. They ought to take Introduction to Economics, and they would learn that minimum wage law just unemploys people whose productivity is below whatever level is stipulated.
Let's say hypothetically that we abolish minimum wage law, and do you believe that prices would go down, that inflation would be checked?
No, inflation is really a monetary phenomenon. If Ben Bernanke would stop pumping up the money supply, we wouldn't have as much inflation. So I think if we had no minimum wage at all, the prices might go down very slightly because there'd be more people working. All the people who are now unemployed, all these young, mainly black or disproportionately black, I should say, unskilled workers, teenagers, mentally handicapped people, all these people who now are unemployable would now become employable, and the GDP would increase 1% or 2%. And if the money stayed the same, prices would come down a little bit, but it wouldn't have much of an effect. The main effect would be people who are now consigned to a life of idleness, which is a criminal thing to do to make people bored. Hope I'm not boring anyone in my economics lectures. But it's a criminal thing to make people bored, and they're making them bored because their productivity is lower than the 750 or the 9. And since 9 is higher than 750, an additional number of people will now become unemployed, who are now employed.
Okay. Now, I've been poring over data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I have highlighted and checked, or looked into basically every single wage increase that has happened since 1948. And usually what happens in cost graphics, 6 months after wages are increased, unemployment goes down, usually, until recently when we waited 9 and 10 years between wage increases, and that's when unemployment goes up, especially for teens, especially for uneducated young people. Do you believe that maybe it's just the fact that maybe we're waiting so long between these wage increases?
Well, I think that the reason for this, I mean, minimum wage isn't the only thing that creates unemployment. It's necessary, but it's sufficient for unemployment, but it's not necessary. There are other things that create unemployment. And these things are varying also. For example, I don't know, unemployment insurance. That creates unemployment because we have upward sloping supply curves, which means the more I pay you to do something, the more people will do it. Well, the more I pay you to be unemployed, the more unemployment we'll have. And then we have the business cycle, and there are all sorts of machinery comes in, and now all of a sudden the typewriter people are unemployed because now we have computers, or cars come in and the horse and buggy people are unemployed. So there are many other things that create unemployment. I should say technological things just create temporarily unemployment until people get new jobs. So I don't think you can go by these statistics. I think these statistics are worthless. It's a matter of logic. And the logic says that if you compel employers to pay X amount, anyone whose productivity is less than X isn't going to be employed. In the long run, in equilibrium, which we never reach, but we are always moving in that direction.
Okay. Do you believe that we would reach equilibrium if we abolish minimum wage?
No, we would never reach equilibrium if we abolish the minimum wage. Equilibrium is sort of like a perfect gas in physics or chemistry or wherever they have perfect gases or frictionless systems in physics. You never reach it, but you're always moving in that direction Because if you pay more than productivity, you go broke, and if you pay less than productivity, competition increases the wage. Look, getting back to you, I stipulate, arguendo, that your productivity is $5 an hour. And right now your wage is a penny an hour, say. Well, if I'm paying you a penny an hour and you're worth $5 an hour, how much profit I'm making off of you? How much? $4.99. Well, what's this other employer right here next to me going to say about that? No, I'll offer you 2 cents. 2 cents. Remember, the employers are trying to exploit workers. What kind of capitalist pig are you? Got to exploit workers. And now he's applauding me for exploiting you, but he'd rather exploit you for the tune of $4.98 than have me exploit you to the tune of $4.99. And then the third employer will say, well, I'll give 3 cents an hour. And someone else will say 4 cents an hour. Now, I don't say that we'll go through this bidding. We might reach the $5 right away or get close to it. But the point is that as long as there's this gigantic profit opportunity, it's an unstable thing. Like if you're making $1 an hour and your productivity is 5, well, then somebody is making $4 an hour off of you. Someone else is going to say $1.01, $1.02. Will it ever get to $5? Well, in equilibrium it will, and things change, so it's hard. It's sort of a moving target. But the point is, you can't have much of a gap between productivity and wage, because that's a profit opportunity for someone else. So if you're making $2 an hour and your productivity is $5 an hour, I'm making $3 an hour off of you. I'm going to get rich. And I'm going to start worrying that maybe someone else will grab you up. And I'll start saying, well, I'll give you a raise to $2.25 or $2.50. It's going to get to $5 an hour. Look, the reason LeBron James makes a lot of money is because his productivity is magnificent. He puts rear ends in the seats to watch him play. The reason I make a middle-class salary is because I have a middle-class productivity. The reason you bum, have only a productivity of $5 an hour, I'm glad you're laughing, I don't mean to insult you, is because you don't have any skills. And your productivity is low. Wages tend to be equated with productivity. Perfectly, no, but you can't get too much of a gap, because if you get a gap, then someone will rush in and lower the gap. So wages tend to equal productivity. Minimum wage law doesn't raise anyone's productivity. Minimum wage isn't going to help LeBron James or help me or even help you. It'll hurt you. It won't hurt me, because my productivity is above minimum wage and LeBron James's productivity is way above minimum wage. It'll hurt you because you're only worth $5 an hour, and now Obama, and by the way, I don't want to blame just Obama, Mitt Romney also favored the minimum wage, so it's not a Democrat, Republican, white, or black. They're all idiots, and they're all evil, and they're all criminals, because I think it's a criminal activity to pass a law that makes it impossible for you to get a job. They hurt you a lot more than if they took your wallet or they stole your tripod or whatever it was. That's a vicious, depraved, immoral thing to do, to pass a law that makes it impossible for anyone to hire you. Isn't that horrible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's go out and get them. I'm sorry.
Do you know of any nations that don't have a minimum wage law?
I'm not sure. I suspect places that are more economically free than the U.S. and Canada and Western Europe, I suspect, I haven't done the research on this, but I suspect there'd be places like Singapore, Hong Kong, Switzerland, the most free enterprise countries, Monaco maybe. I'm not sure about that. But I'll tell you this, minimum wages only came into existence in the U.S. in 1948, 46, somewhere in there. We didn't have minimum wages in the 1920s and the 1910s or the 1890s, and yet wages weren't zero, right? Well, that's a different issue about the inflation level, but the point is that in 1890, if you were a skilled blacksmith or a skilled person that could do whatever it is that they did then, make horses and buggies or something, or a farmer, you had a living wage. I mean, if you didn't have a living wage, you would die. And there was no minimum wage propping up wages, supposedly. So don't think that, you know, your question is, well, are there any countries without a minimum wage? Are their wages down in the toilet? No. And we know that the minimum wage only came into existence in the 1940s or 30s. I'm not sure exactly what. 36 it was? Okay, well, you're You're better informed on this than I. You seem pretty sure of that.
Yep, it was 38, 1938.
Okay, well, 1938. Well, in 1922, we didn't have one. People lived. Poor people had jobs. You didn't have mass starvation like in the Ukraine with the Soviets.
Um, do you think that small businesses will be hurt if we raise them to $5?
Small businesses, maybe a little bit. It'll be a little inconvenient. They're going to have to fire people whose productivity is between 750 and 9. And what they'll do is hire more people whose productivity is $10, $11, $12 an hour and more technology, and they'll substitute for them. So I don't think they might be hurt a little bit because they'll have to change, they'll have to fire people, they'll have to hire other people, which is not costless. So they'll be hurt a little bit. But the main victims will be unemployable youth.
Okay. And disabled people.
Disabled people, sure. Not so much physically disabled people, because if I'm in a wheelchair, I can still type, and even if I'm blind, I can. There are professors who are blind. Mentally handicapped people are the ones that have very low productivity. They're the ones who are impossible to employ because their productivity is much lower than physically handicapped people. Arms and legs and eyes are just the convenience. I mean, they're nice to have, but brain power is much more important.
Okay. What would you suggest for the people that are unemployable at below the minimum, that have a productivity of less than the minimum wage? How could we ensure that they are fed, that they're sheltered, that they're clothed?
Oh, get rid of the minimum wage. What they ought to do is go and tar and feather, and worse, to the politicians who were responsible for this.
And if they were paid less than what the minimum wage is now, do you believe that they would still be able to survive?
Well, they'd be better able to survive. Remember, I answered this question. I said $5 an hour for you is better than 0 an hour.
Yes.
Now, what the government does is first it unemploys you, and now you're down to 0, and then it gives you welfare. So, if they give you more welfare than you could earn, well, then you're better off financially, but you're not better off in terms of learning new skills. If you're unemployable and they give you welfare and you're sitting around and you're going to get into crime or drugs or something, your life is much worse than if you were making $5 an hour. But you have to hold things equal. In other words, hold the welfare payments constant. And let's say they give you $100 a week welfare. Well, they should give you $100 a week whether you're employed or unemployed. They won't, but they should if you want to make an equal comparison. And then if we have the minimum wage, you get 0 from employment. If they don't, you get $5 an hour from employment plus whatever the government is going to give you. In other words, hold that constant in your mind. So don't think that, see, the tenor of your questions keeps being, well, the minimum wage is really helping people. If we didn't have it, they'd starve. No.
Okay. I mean, there are countries that offer basically everybody as a citizen gets a flat rate, and if they are employed, then they add that to it. And the countries like Norway and Denmark.
Yeah, probably the Scandinavian countries give welfare to everybody, but you have to go ceteris paribus. You have to hold other things equal. Either say no one gets any of that or everyone gets it, and now just focus narrowly on the minimum wage, and you're $5 an hour ahead if there's no minimum wage than if there is. If there is, you get nothing. You're unemployable. You can't learn. You can't get on-the-job training. You can't increase your productivity. See, if you could just get a job at $5 an hour, you're going to learn to be on time, to smile at customers, to listen to what the boss says, not to fight with the other customers, and now all of a sudden your productivity is $10 an hour. But if you can't get that first rung of the job, you're unemployable. Let me tell you a story. I was listening to Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first woman Supreme Court judge, and I heard an interview on her, and what she said is that when she got out of law school in the 1950s, she was unemployable. No company would offer her a job. No legal firm would offer her a job. She attributed it to sexism, which is a whole other issue. And then what happened is she went to some attorney general in California, I forget exactly who, and the guy said, look, I have no budget, but I'll hire you. And I'll give you a desk, and you can do some work. And as soon as I get another amount of money, I'll pay you. And in the meantime, you can work. And she did that. What would happen to her if the minimum wage law was upheld fully? She would go to jail because she was violating the minimum wage law. We had a minimum wage law in the 50s.
So by working for free, she was violating.
By working for free, she was violating the minimum wage law, so she should have been put in jail. A Supreme Court justice. And the nice attorney general or whoever it was that hired her should be put in jail because they were violating the minimum wage law.
I mean, I remember that interview.
Oh, you listened to that too?
I love NPR.
Oh, okay. Well, I heard it on NPR too, and we got to go and try to get that gal into jail. Just like we've got to get Obama in jail. He said he smoked pot, marijuana. Clinton never inhaled. Now, I'm not sure if you're smoking without inhaling, you should go to jail. But Clinton and Obama should go to jail for breaking the drug laws. And Obama and the woman, Supreme Court judge, Senator Day O'Connor, jail. If we were going to uphold this crappy law.
I'm glad that I got because I mean I was afraid that I was only going to get an economist that would support it, but I know that's 50-50. Economists, half of economists support.
Oh no, it's nothing like 50-50. It's probably 95-5.
95-5.
95-5 are against it.
So 95% are against it.
Yeah.
And 5% are for it.
Yeah, but the 5% who are in favor of it are very mouthy, like Krugman. Paul Krugman, who writes for the New York Times, has a Nobel Prize in economics. They ought to take away his Nobel Prize, and they ought to take away his PhD. I mean, we have recall for cars. The clutch doesn't work or the steering wheel doesn't work. They recall the car. They ought to recall Krugman and take away his PhD and take away his whatever. Of course, he would say the same thing about me, but that's a different issue. It's interesting. Speaking of Krugman, I just read something by him in the New York Times on raise the minimum wage. And what he says, let me see if I got a copy of it. Let me see if I got a copy of it here. Yeah, here it is. Let me read about what Krugman, the idiot, says. He says, President Barack Obama laid out a number of good ideas in his State of the Union address. Unfortunately, most of them would require spending. Yak. Here we go. One major proposal, however, wouldn't involve budget outlays. The president's call for a rise in minimum wage from $7.25 an hour to $9, with subsequent increases in line with inflation. The question we need to ask is, would this be a good policy? And the answer is, perhaps surprisingly, is a clear yes. Why somewhat surprisingly? This is the good part. Well, Economics 101 tells us to be very cautious about attempts to legislate market outcomes. Every textbook, mine included, he has a textbook that gives the usual stuff that I've been giving you. Mine included lays out the unintended consequences, bullshit about unintended consequences, I'll talk about that in a minute, that flow from policies like rent control, agricultural price supports, and minimum wage. Even most liberal economists, by liberal he means like him, progressive, liberal, pinko, lefty, would, I suspect, agree that setting a minimum wage of, say, $20 an hour would create a lot of problems. Well, now that's interesting. If the minimum wage law was raised to $20 an hour, then people with a productivity of 18 an hour would be unemployed.
Pretty high productivity.
That's pretty high productivity, but you'd be unemployed at 20. He admits that. Well, then why doesn't he see that keeping it at 750 unemploys people below 750 and raising it to 9 will unemploy anyone below 9? He doesn't see it. And yet in his textbook, he's very good. So he's criticizing his own textbook. The man is incomprehensible, contradictory, self-contradictory. I mean, in his textbook, he lays it out roughly the way I laid it out. And now he says he favors it. Well, if he favors it, look, if I hated young people, I hate young people. Young people are evil. They're an abomination, especially young black people and unskilled people. I hate them. And I want to really get them. How can I get them? I got it. I'll make it impossible for them to get jobs. I'll raise the minimum wage to $9 an hour or $12 an hour or higher. Whoever I hate, I'll raise the minimum wage to just a little bit above their productivity.
That's a very poignant point.
Very despicable stuff. Now, this unintended consequences, that's BS. You have to ask the question, I don't know if you have it on your list, but I'll ask it for you and I'll answer it. If the minimum wage law is so bloody horrible, why do we have it? In economics, there's this thing, quo bono, qui bono, quo bono, I'm a little weak on Latin, who benefits? You know, look, whenever there's a crime, there's a dead body lying on the ground. The first thing the detective says is, who benefits? If it's an old man, they look at a young wife, maybe she wants to get rid of him, or the kids want to get rid of him, or business competitors. Who benefits from this guy being dead? That's the first person. If it's a spouse, you look at the other spouse. So in detective work, you always ask who benefits. Now, that's not definitive. You know, just because you benefited from the murder of this guy doesn't mean that you did it, but you're a suspect. You had motive. Now, you might have a good excuse, you were somewhere else, or we have DNA that this guy did it, but still, we're looking carefully at you because you have motive. So who has motive? Well, one person who has motive is people who hate young people, right? They want to be unemployed. Another group is organized labor, unions. Now, here's the story on that. I need a cough drop. I'm going to have to take a break. Okay. I'm a drug addict. It's just cough drops, not just, not controlled. I'm sorry? No LSD on these cough drops. Okay, so here's the union situation. The union comes into the boss. They're making $20 an hour, but they're way above minimum wage, and they say, well, we need 25. Otherwise, we're going to go on strike. What reaction does the boss have? Well, the boss knows that you can make the product with a lot of skilled workers, or some skilled workers at 20 or 25, and then a whole bunch of unskilled workers at 10 or 12, or 5 or 6, or whatever. And there's a certain proportion. And anytime one factor of production goes up in price, you tend to hire the other guys. Look, if you were making rowboats, and you could make them out of plastic, wood, or metal, and I tell you that the price of metal doubled, you're going to start making robots out of plastic and wood, and fewer out of metal. And anytime, look, you like hot dogs and pizza, and I tell you pizza prices doubled, well, you'll have less pizza and more hot dogs. It's just common economic sense. Okay, so now the wage goes up from 20 to 25 for skilled workers. I'll substitute some unskilled workers. Well, yeah, it doesn't have to be one for one, but I'll fire 10 or 20% of the skilled workers, and I'll hire maybe 40% more unskilled workers, because the unskilled workers can't do as much as the skilled workers. And I'll have a new proportion, just like you had a new proportion in your rowboat production, or your pizza versus hot dogs, or whatever it was. Now, in the old days, before the minimum wage, the union doesn't like this. And what the union would do would have a picket line, and they would call the low-paid workers scabs, which seems like hate speech to me, but what do I know? I'm not politically correct. And they would try to beat them up, slash their car tires, beat them up with clubs, whatever. The problem is that the scabs fight back, and the union doesn't like that. So they came up with this ingenious idea to price out of competition their competitors. Get an A, get to the head of the class. Namely, the last thing the union wants is for the employer to start firing union workers and hiring relatively unskilled workers. So in order to obviate that possibility, they say, let's have a minimum wage. Look, in South Africa, under apartheid, there were certain jobs that were reserved for whites, and there were certain jobs that were reserved for blacks. The problem is that a lot of the blacks could do the job of dynamiting in the, what do you call it, diamond factory, or the diamond mine, Beers mine, whatever. And the employers just wanted to make money. Their bias was green, not black or white, just green. And they started hiring blacks. Now, the whites were more skilled than the blacks in them our days, So the white racist unions came up with this great idea from their perspective, namely, let's have a minimum wage, which will stop the employers from hiring blacks to substitute for us. They were geniuses. But it's the same thing. In other words, they were racists, but they understood economics. Okay, so I'm asking who benefits. Well, one is old curmudgeons who hate young people. Another is unionists. Another one is policemen. Because not so much policemen, although policemen, but more jail guards. Because if you have vast numbers of unemployed young people, they're going to get in trouble and they're going to be put in prison. And now there'll be more jobs for you. Now, I don't say that they're guilty. I just say that they're suspects because they benefit from the minimum wage, which creates unemployment for unskilled workers. I think it's more unions, and I think it's less curmudgeons and fewer social workers and psychiatrists and other people who have to deal with unemployment. But if I were a detective, I would look at them too. But I've done a little detective work, and I know it's mainly unions. And then the unions, the politicians have to follow this because we have invincible ignorance on the part of the electorate. I mean, you take a survey, and most people favor the minimum wage law. They say, well, don't you want to help the poor? Don't you want? It's not a living wage, $7.50. You need $9 an hour. I'm not going to answer that. Hopefully, it'll stop ringing in a minute.
Yeah, I have a Gallup poll right here that was released 2 days ago.
Oh, okay.
71% of people support raising the minimum wage.
Look, every time I get a freshman class in microeconomics and I take a survey, same thing, 70, 80, 90%, because it's just human decency to support a minimum wage, because who could be against raising wages for the poor? I mean, it sounds good. But if you know just a little bit of economics, which hopefully my freshman students learn after I pound it at them, then hopefully you see it for the abomination that it is.
Really, it keeps people down.
It keeps the poor down. You know, there's this, I teach a course, Economics and Religion, and one of the Jesuit Catholic social thought is the preferential option for the poor. Namely, when you look at any social policy, look at it from the eyeglasses of the poor, because if you hurt the rich, you'll make them middle class. If you hurt the middle class, you'll make them poor. If you hurt the poor, you're going to devastate them. So I think it's a reasonable way to look at social policy, and let's look at the minimum wage like that. The minimum wage devastates the poor. So you'd think that if they're against anything, they'd be against the minimum wage, but they don't know any bloody economics. So that somehow they favor it. Now, I don't say that people who favor it should be put in jail because free speech and all, but people actively pass this legislation and support this legislation, those people, when the Libertarian Nuremberg trial gets to going, those people better watch out.
The Libertarian Nuremberg trial.
Yeah, when and if we have one, those people better start shaking in their boots because we're going to come get you. Because you're evil, you're an abomination. You're picking on the weakest people in the economy and you're pulverizing them. That's horrible.
I'm glad I interviewed you.
Great.
You're a very powerful interview.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. And remember, give me the URL for it or I'll haunt you forever.
I can see right now, actually.
Oh, okay.
You
Great.
can see what I've covered so far.
Well, you've run out of questions?
Yeah, well, no, it's not that.
Go ahead. If you have more questions,
I'm starving.
Oh, that's because you don't have a living wage. We have to pass a minimum wage to help increase your wages.
Well, the best policy for me would be just to graduate. Just like I don't know who said it, but the best form of welfare is a job.
That's very good. I support that. The best form of welfare is to let people work because then they can learn on the job and they can increase their productivity.
Yeah.
Whereas if you can't learn and you're a teenager, you're going to get into trouble. You're going to go to jail. The cops have got more and better guns, you know. It's horrible.
Well, I've made investments so that I can, in my education, so that I can go.
Well, your productivity won't be $5 an hour, that's for sure.
It'll be more than that, hopefully.
Okay. Well, this is just your email address. I want the URL.
That's my URL. johnpollardwello.wordpress.com.
And if I look at that, I'll see this interview now?
Yep. That's my blog.
Whoa,
You can
okay.
go see what I've covered thus far.
Okay, let's see.